gosh, it didn't look quite that the same proportions when it was David standing up here. Now, you're squashed in between the IMF and the ECB in my agenda, so I haven't got a scripted speech. Those of you who know me know that's the usual Sharon Bowles disclaimer. So you're going to get what's off the top of my head and a few notes I scribbled last night. I think it's worth putting in context how we do these things in the EU. And we've been doing a wider range of legislation than was done in Dodd-Frank. Now, that's entirely our fault. And we didn't need to do AIFMD mortgages, supervisory architecture, PRIPS, not to mention a few. Oh, and there's also some sovereign debt stuff and an FTT and a few other things that have distracted us or taken a lot of our time. The second point is that we do have to do, at the level of the legislator, a lot of the detail that in the United States is done by the regulators. Now, this inevitably means that we're in a kind of game of nudge, that one gets ahead and then the other, and I think that we can use that to our advantage, that we are not entirely simultaneous in everything that we do. So there's, you know, maybe if we take it in turns, we can be the ones that provide the fix. But on top of all of the legislation that we do, we have got level 2, and the Parliament still has a role to play in scrutinising the level 2 legislation and, if need be, vetoing it. And we take this scrutiny role very seriously, and the Commission also takes it seriously that we should be involved. I mean, we've had our teething troubles, but that's really because the processes are all new. And I can say that on EMIR, we've so far now got our act together in terms of planning what ahead when the next technical standards will be coming out. We know that, in fact, some of them will be bundled together with the equivalence provisions because it doesn't make sense to do them separately. I suppose the bad news for some of you in that is that it means that the Parliament indeed will be looking very closely at what the equivalence language is. So it's a tough life for us in the Parliament, so that's why we get stroppy from time to time. Now, one of the advantages, I think, of the European system at the end is that we have one set of rules. We have one set of rules that is applying across all of the EU. We don't have overlapping regulators, so you might have two sets of rules applying within the EU. I think that's helpful to third countries, and maybe one could draw a comparison there that although it's only one jurisdiction, the United States doesn't necessarily get all its act together in terms of under one regulator, one set of rules. Looking briefly at the G20 and international level, of course, a lot of effort has gone into agreeing the G20 framework and then either individual sets of rules or from the international standard setting bodies have come forward. We've already had a list of who they are. Unfortunately, the standard setters cannot take all of the decisions. And you can't escape from the fact that many of the so-called technical matters embedded in legislation have highly political results for which it's politicians that are accountable. It's actually politicians who have lost seats, governments that have fallen as a consequence of the financial crisis. I've not seen any standard setters or regulators getting the push. And I think that that's something to reflect upon, and politicians, I think, take this very seriously. Again, we have an added layer of complexity on that in the EU, in that we cannot do certain things, delegating it down to regulators or to the European supervisory authorities. But we are determined that we won't have variation across the EU, and that is what provides us with the dilemma that we have to do great detail at the legislative level, and then only things that don't have, if you like, policy and large amounts of discrimination cannot be done by the European supervisory authorities. And that's the way we do stuff, and it does mean a heavy workload. If we look at the international standard setters, Basel is still not finished doing the trading book. Now, I thought that they were starting to finish doing the trading book when I first came into this Parliament, round about when they were finishing off on Basel II. So I think this shows that the standard setting bodies are also not perfect. And to be honest, I think there are things in there that are far too complex. I can mention the CVA charge, in which I know a lot of you know I have been active. And really, sometimes things don't work if you apply the same sets of rules when the markets aren't the same. In fact, to take a leaf out of what we all hope to achieve in the third country arrangements and in the arrangements between the EU and the US, it actually is outcomes that you have to look at. And that it indeed even applies when you're looking at some of the higher level of the legislation. Looking cross-border, I think there are various issues. Institutions need legal certainty over whose sets of rules are going to apply. And that, as has already been said, ideally this is only one set, or that it's clear that you don't have to try and juggle between two different sets. Alas, that's not always the case, as I've indicated, even within the United States. But one set of rules that financial institutions have to apply is obviously going to be better for a level playing field. I've already said that outcome-oriented, I think, has to be the way, and I've extended, if you like, outcome-oriented to mean we should actually perhaps look at it a little bit earlier, even amongst the standard setting. So I'm happy to hear a lot of what the SEC have said, and I had a good meeting with them last week. We've got problems, I think, with branches and subsidiaries. We can't really have the situation that the customer gets treated differently or the client gets treated differently in a particular country, dependent upon whether they're facing a branch or a subsidiary. And I think that we may have to look at that quite carefully in order to stop international creeping subsidiarisation, or maybe we have to grasp the nettle and say, well, right, that's what we're going to have to do. But at the moment, there are risks that branches and subsidiaries are not getting the same treatment. I think if you start to look at transactions that are cross-border, so you've got one leg in each camp, it's not just a question of services being supplied by an entity that has a different home regulator, then of course, as we know with derivatives, it gets a lot more complicated. Now, going back to capital requirements, we've been doing Basel for quite a long time. So maybe we should have a look at where we've got to. I think most EU-US spats have all been about competition, and a lot of the comparisons are really quite bogus. As I've already said, the markets are not the same. That's something that is usually overlooked. It's not the same scope of banks. This is conveniently forgotten. I mean, every exemption that we've put into CRD4 for some small local bank is obviously not going to be applied to a SIFI, so stop pretending that that's what we've really done. We don't operate on the same accounting rules. This is a major problem. And we don't actually have banks that are operating the same banking models. And I'm not sure that the approval processes are necessarily all that coordinated either. So basically the regulation and what we face is far too complex, I think, for it ever to be even, or possibly even when you're just looking at the letters. So this is one reason why we don't stop working at it, but I'm absolutely behind the notions of simplification. Now, referring again to the latest spat on the CVA charge, that's based on the fact that you need to have highly liquid corporate bond markets and CDS in order to make it work and to get a value that works. Well, that works very nicely in the United States. It doesn't work anywhere else. It's an absolutely disastrous for developing countries, and therefore it will be really bad for trade. So what we've done in Europe with the exemption there is it's not really saying we want an arbitrage. It's saying we actually think that the whole CVA section needs a lot of work alongside the trading book. It needs looked at again to make workable and simple and be calibrated, and then we can all hopefully carry on with something where it doesn't favour one jurisdiction over another in any way whatsoever. What we've got at the moment is prohibitive for everybody who is outside the United States. If we turn to derivatives, then a huge effort has been made on coordination, and I'll just highlight two areas where I'm disappointed so far. The first is on trade repositories and what might potentially be the global lack of sharing of information instead of the sharing of information. I mean, this was really one of the big prizes that we expected out of derivatives legislation, that central banks and supervisors around the globe would get some kind of information about these huge flows and balances and who is at risk. And frankly, if we don't get our act together on trade repositories, I don't think we should have bothered. CCPs, I think that's also in a little bit of a mess. I think it's for slightly different reasons. We've got different liquidity requirements. I think that might be Europe's fault for putting caution ahead of other things. But it seems we can't get to be international without multiple authorizations. For instance, you might find you need to have authorizations one way and another just to do EU, US work by the UK, ESMA, the SEC and the CFTC. Well, I guess at least you know what an authorization is, so you can do 4 of them in their various layers for their various things. The capital rules are also uncertain. Do you follow ESMA, the SEC or the CFTC? Do you pick one or do you add them all together? Governance, well, that then, so it seems to depend upon whose customer it is rather than where you are. So, I mean, this is a total mess, and we actually have to work together to try and sort it out. And I absolutely know that work is going on. But at the moment, we seem to have got quite a lot of problems to solve. I think it gets a lot worse for the CCPs if you then start looking, well, actually, and what have we done for the rest of the world? Because we might be very keen to have EU, US correct and working, but I mean, we're doing ourselves absolutely no favours with the rest of the world if we shut them out. And sometimes by looking at and how is this going to apply somewhere else, maybe gives us the clue as to where we can find our common ground. I think I've probably said enough to make me not friends with a few people. But looking forward to the future, I mean, obviously we want something that is fairer and workable. We can't have things where parts of the world or parts of industries cease to function. We can't have something that doesn't deliver what were the big prizes in the G20 agreement just for the sake of a little spat over something or other that happens to upset a bank here or there. This does mean that we have to look deeper. I'm afraid it does mean that the Basel Committee has certainly got to look deeper, and that's a project you might by now have noticed is that I'm onto. We need transparency. We need to be able to interrogate data. I mean, what is the point of doing all this if we still don't know what is going on? What are we doing about the sort of electronic identifiers and the real-time transaction mapping? Those are the things we should be aiming at, not these sort of little spats over a bit of equivalence here and there that maybe is not actually that crucial, but is more turf wars. So that's where I will end, and I'll try to be a little bit more controversial when we get into the questions. Thank you.